joining us to discuss all of this from our home state, Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey. Sir, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for fighting for free speech. So give us the latest, because we know the fight's ongoing, and we know that this administration is not going to let go of that censorship without one.
Well, you're absolutely right. We're not going to let Joe Biden destroy the First Amendment right to free speech in the United States of America. And that's why this is so important. We've got to build a wall of separation between tech and state. The first brick of that wall was laid as a part of this lawsuit on the 4th of July. What a great way to celebrate this nation's independence by re-fulfilling the promise, that legacy of freedom provided to us by the founders in the First Amendment. The whole idea behind the First Amendment is to invite dissent and discussion and have an uninhibited marketplace of ideas free from government censorship. And yet what we've uncovered as part of this lawsuit is a relationship of both coercion and collusion from the White House across a spectrum of federal bureaucratic agencies with their woke cronies and big tech social media corporations to silence American voices. And 3 points I want to make. Number one, they only went after core political speech. So it was illegal to take down the speech the federal government targeted on social media. But number two, all the speech they targeted as dis or malinformation happened to be true. And finally, it was exclusively conservative. So all that they want to do is weaponize big tech social media to silence any voice of opposition, which runs afoul of the legacy of freedom provided to us by the framers and ratifiers of the First Amendment.
Yeah, we're talking with Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey, who's been fighting on behalf of the First Amendment for all of us. Got that major win on July 4th. You mentioned something, sir, that was very important: coercion. Because in looking at all of this, and I followed your thread, there was nothing in there that indicated that it was the tech companies that approached the administration. It was the administration that was pestering and reaching out repeatedly to these tech companies saying, oh, we think this is misinformation or this might be misleading, when, as you said, it was actually truthful information. They were really driving this, weren't they?
Absolutely. Look at that thread of emails, and we're talking specifically. We have more than 20,000 pages of documents, numerous depositions, and we've only scratched the surface. But the email chain you're specifically referring to is a series of emails in March, April, and May of 2021 between the White House and Facebook. And look at how the people at the White House are treating the folks at big tech social media. I mean, first of all, they're not real sympathetic, but secondly, the White House is berating them, cussing at them, making specific demands of them. And Jen Psaki from the White House podium said, hey, look, they know exactly what we're asking for here. And let's put this in context. This is after Joe Biden on both the stump and from the White House lawn had said, look, Facebook is killing people. If they don't up their censorship game, we're going to repeal or amend Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to take away their cash cow, their protection, their shield from legal liability. And so it is absolutely a coercive and collusive relationship. This is pressure coming from the White House, and it got so big so fast that the federal government actually had to create a new bureaucratic structure to manage the vast censorship enterprise, because it's gotten that big that fast. There were so many requests made by federal officials of big tech social media to silence truthful conservative voices in violation of the First Amendment that they had to systematize it. So this is dangerous stuff. It's getting worse, not better. These are the worst First Amendment violations in this nation's history, and we've got to build that wall of separation between tech and state now before we get into the 2024 election cycle.
Yeah, and you make a good point also, again, with the Section 230, because this was also after you had Mark Zuckerberg and all of these other tech representatives sitting before Congress. And of course, they're there before a Democrat administration. They have a Democrat Senate, you have a Democrat president. I mean, of course, they're probably going to be more inclined and more receptive to these, collusion offers, because these are the people who might be, however, whether the legislation is credible or not, they're the ones who are going to be driving the legislation, passing the legislation. So they're kind of, stuck between a rock and a hard place on that.
Yeah, and I mean, don't get me wrong. They are predisposed to go in lockstep with the federal government, but the federal government was making really specific demands. Take down that Tommy Lahren post. Take down that Tucker Carlson post. Silence any voice that questions the vaccine, the effectiveness of the vaccine or effectiveness of masks. And COVID was really just the Trojan horse to get the enemy behind the walls. We know that it's expanded to election integrity issues. It's expanded to global warming issues, questioning transgender rights and so forth. So the federal government is dedicated to this censorship enterprise. It's gotten too big, too fast, and too unwieldy, and that's why they're appealing. If you read the 155-page court order that came down on the 4th of July, the very end of it is telling, and all the court is saying is that the federal government is prohibited from coercing and colluding with big tech social media to silence core political speech. That was speech that was always protected by the First Amendment. All the court is saying is, don't violate the Constitution. Well, what is there to appeal? Why is the federal government that committed to censorship, to violating our constitutional rights to free speech, but for a nefarious purpose?
There are also those talking with Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey, who, other people celebrated Independence Day with fireworks, he celebrated by getting this massive First Amendment win. I mean, that's a way to it's probably the most American celebration. You win the award on that. That's a pretty good one.
Hey, I was flipping burgers with one hand and reading a 155-page court order with the other.
God bless America. Woo! Somewhere an eagle smiled if they could. So the whole idea of, because you have private enterprise with tech, and then you have, obviously big government, this government. It's one thing if you are, a private entity that decides to do something of your own volition, but the way that the nature of this relationship, by, everything that we've seen publicly, the emails, the discussions, everything, they were acting as agents of state. They were no longer acting like individual privately owned companies at this point, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And therein lies the problem. Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act has been used as both a sword and a shield by these big tech social media corporations. And that makes them vulnerable to coercion from the federal government. Like I said, we know that both Vice President Kamala Harris and President Joe Biden have threatened repeal or amendment of Section 230 of the CDA. We know that they've also threatened antitrust litigation against these companies if they don't do the federal government's bidding. And then the federal government created a structure to systematize and channelize those specific requests targeting core political speech of conservatives on big tech social media. And social media was happy to go along. And that's why the wall of separation is so important. I mean, at the end of the day, Section 230 of the CDA has been misinterpreted by the courts, yes, and it's allowed this monopoly to go on. And that's not good for freedom. It's not good for open market competition. And at the end of the day, Americans suffer for that.
Yeah. And we've talked about Section 230 on this program a lot because I in the early days, I understand where it came from. We talked about the history of it, its creation, but at the same time, if you have something that is acting as a publisher, and and I know that the actual law doesn't talk about platforms or social media companies, but if you're acting as a publisher, you can editorialize with algorithms. People need to realize that we're in, a new digital era, and that editorialization extends beyond just words. It gets into coding. It gets into the way that things are presented, online. That's editorialization, and everyone else is protected, but or everyone else has liability if they run afoul of that. But social media companies, unless they're acting fairly, then you're acting as a publisher. That's editorialization.
That's absolutely right. I mean, no one would accept it if you were talking on your cell phone and you started saying something the cell phone company didn't like, and the cell phone company started muting you. And that, no one would accept that. And that's what's going on when big tech social media is censoring conservative voices. But what I'm talking about is way worse, because here it's being done at the behest of the government. Yeah. If you go back to those emails from Rob Flaherty and the White House digital strategies team there in March, April, and May of 2021, he is specifically saying, take down that post. That is the federal government making a demand after having threatened to remove the civil liability, prohibition on civil liability for these companies. So they had an economic incentive to do the federal government's bidding. They're absolutely acting on the government's behalf. It's a third party. At the end of the day, the federal government can't do through a third party what it's prohibited from doing directly. And I go back to the court order of July 4th. All the judge is saying is, don't violate the Constitution. Well, why are we in such a rush to appeal that? And so, I think people are beginning to understand how bad this was. Thank goodness Elon Musk bought Twitter and opened up the Twitter files. But there's no such thing as the Facebook files or the Instagram files. There's no equivalent on these other big tech platforms. That's why this lawsuit's so important. It's the first step in uncovering some of this misfeasance, malfeasance, and some of this coercion and collusion on behalf of the federal government.
You noted that they were so quick to file. I mean, July 5th, the next day, they filed the appeal.
Yeah, no, they are dedicated to this vast censorship enterprise. They think that they get to control what is and isn't true, when in fact it's the American public that gets to make that determination. The First Amendment is designed to protect us from government. And instead of protecting our rights, in this instance, President Biden and his federal cohorts are violating our rights and denying us the ability to build consensus about what we believe. Yeah. And that clearly is the whole purpose of the First Amendment.
So this goes, I think, tell us the latest status of this, because I know with the appeal, I don't think there's going to be movement until later next month, correct?
Yeah, August 10th. So we'll be back in court on August 10th at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. We've got a 3-judge panel that'll hear argument on the merits of this, and then we'll be back down at the district court level. Our hope would be that, and our expectation is, based on our good legal position, the court, we put on evidence back in May, and that justified the preliminary injunction, and the quantum of evidence we adduced was sufficient to convince the judge that there were likely constitutional violations on behalf of the federal government, and so that's why the nationwide injunction was important. We're going to defend that at the Fifth Circuit all the way up to the United States Supreme Court if we have to. eventually we'll end up back at the trial court. And we're going to get to the meat and potatoes. We've only begun to scratch the surface of this vast censorship enterprise. Again, COVID was the Trojan horse that got the enemy behind the gates. We know it's expanded, but we don't know how far yet. So we've got to leave no stone unturned as we root out this vast censorship enterprise and continue to build that wall of separation between tech and state.
Last quick thing for you, and that was a great point. That was the COVID was the Trojan horse because they were able, the state was able to get so much power for itself, whether it's mask mandates, whether it's, a million different things. I think this really this is a major precedent that this threatens to set with speech. Just reinforce to everyone listening across the country and people watching the simulcast how important this decision is going to be.
Yeah. Do we want the federal government telling us what we should and shouldn't be allowed to talk about on big tech social media? These are the worst First Amendment violations in this nation's more than 200-year history. This will absolutely make it to the United States Supreme Court. This will be a precedential case, and we're going to stand up and fight for freedom. We're not going to let Joe Biden destroy free speech in America.
There you go. Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey. Sir, we appreciate your fight. Thank you so much for keeping an eye on this and celebrating the most American way I can imagine. God bless you.
Hey, thanks, Dan. All the best to you and your listeners.
Thank you.